I actually wrote 3 books during the lockdown, which is in 5 months. I wrote 3 books. This is the first one. The second one is out also. It's on suicide. It's called In Pursuit of Unhappiness. And the third one is called Pedagogy of Dissent. And it's coming out in, I think, in January.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Galp Lok. Today we have all assembled here for a book discussion on a book which is currently considered to be a topic which is philosophers rejoice as many philosophers are coming up with books on this topic, which is the coronavirus. Today we have gathered here to discuss Ramin Jahanbegloo, an Iranian philosopher, and his book The Courage to Exist, A Philosophy of Life and Death in the Age of Coronavirus. Before I go about introducing the book, I would like to introduce all of you to the panelists that we have with us here today. Along with the author himself, we have 2 discussants with us. First, we have Nath Pathak, who is associated with South Asian University and he teaches sociology. The second panelist that we have with us here today is Parul Bhandari, who is associated with OP Jindal Global School, and she too is a sociologist. And Parul Bhandari has extensively worked on social institutions like family, marriage, Indian cinema, and contemporary new media. Devnath Pathak, on the other hand, has extensively worked on folklore and the idea of visual culture in contemporary times. Coming back to the author that we have with us today is, needless to say, one of the leading philosophers that we have today. He is not only a polyglottic genius who has written extensively in many languages and not just English, but French, Persian, and has held conversations with other leading philosophers like Isaiah Berlin. He has over 7 publications, and the current book itself has shaken the whole context of philosophy, talking about what coronavirus is or how can life or death be seen from this perspective. He has been a winner of Peace Prize from United Nations Association in Spain in 2009, and he has been famous for promoting dialogues of peace and non-violence across his life. Coming back to the book, I will little bit introduce how the book is structured. The book is really handy. I mean, if someone thinks how philosophers would be dwelling on a crisis topic like pandemic, they might imagine that they are going on and on about it. But Ramin has given us book which is very, very precise and is divided across 6 very small chapters, talking about various stages of life and relating it to the pandemic that we are in today. The topics within the book or the chapterizations include topics like how we see living as, or how suffering can be seen in our life. What does death mean to us? How can we resist that death? How can we create a kind of solidarity within this time of pandemic? And finally, he ends the book with questioning whether post COVID can be seen as a utopian context or like what the Greeks have called the kairos. So, this is briefly the introduction of the book. And now that I have introduced, I would like to hand over the platform to the discussants. First, I would like to invite Parul Bhandari to tell us what she feels about the book and how she dwells with this philosophy of death within this pandemic crisis.
To begin with, what is most interesting in this book to me was the concepts of I and me, that kind of sociological conversation, phenomenological conversations around what constitutes I, me, and the other. I mean, this is what the book is entirely about. We go from, as you rightly said, we move from one chapter to the other, but what we are also moving along, and which would be completely interesting, particularly to sociology and anthropology students, would be this kind of dynamic between I, me, the other, and how we envision ourselves there. So I must say, I quite liked the first, when when I began reading first chapter, the second chapter, I'm like, my God, this is the essence of life. This is the essence of life and being. Particularly the first chapter, you begin with talking about the art of living and how suffering is an important part of art of living. And what is also interesting, I suppose, from my point of view as well as Dave's point of view, is the literary examples that are sprinkled throughout the book, from Shakespeare to Iliad and so on and so forth. And that helps you make sense of so much across so many centuries. So suffering being an integral part of living, and living not being only seen as art of living, is not only being seen as pursuit of happiness, but also somewhere envisioning suffering as something which is incredibly important, revealing not only of oneself, but also of the other and of the other things of yourself, right? So that was quite interesting, and coming again from the perspective of Iliad and Achilles, and like suffering and these great heroes, and actually that takes me to, the second chapter was obviously incredibly interesting because we go further into suffering, the idea of suffering and self-suffering, and which is, of course, the Gandhian figure is the main figure, right? Because then the idea is, look, suffering is also about moral courage. And I think, Ramin, you say something like it is about moral courage and spiritual strength. So we see that it's building up to something. We see that it's building up to telling us what it is like to live in these times, right? What is the meaning of life in these times? And how do we make sense of this absurdity of life? To explain which, of course, you bring in Camus and Camus' Plague particularly. Then, of course, we move on to the chapter on dying. Now, I actually thought, so as I moved on, to be very honest, like from a sociological perspective, the latter part of the book was speaking more to me than the first part, which is, of course, doesn't mean to say that the first part isn't interesting enough. But when you move on to the art of dying, I thought, oh wow, this is incredible, because you're bringing in a perspective of how important the understanding of dying is in the understanding of living. Now here is some interesting aspects which I hope that perhaps when you're speaking you can explain us a little bit more, is the aesthetics and art of dying. And I'll come to that. I have a kind of a question related to that a bit later, just to broaden my understanding of it. But again, a very beautiful, let's say, spin on this important aspect, which often gets overlooked in art of when we are putting forth an art of living. Then the next 3 chapters, to me, I thought that would be quite interesting, because then we are moving on to a more, let's put it this way, macro perspective, right? I mean, we are looking at it from the more collective perspective. So what happens to the question of solidarity? So in this seemingly individualistic pursuit of life and death and experience of suffering, how do we make sense of society, solidarity, community, questions of trust, responsibility, empathy becomes incredibly crucial. So then it becomes more of a conversation in the realm of, one could say, classic sociological frameworks, particularly that of Durkheim, Emile Durkheim. When you're talking about solidarity, of course, you're thinking about him. When you're talking about death, you're thinking about 4 kinds of suicide that Durkheim talks about. So for me, as I moved on to the latter part of the book, I was like, okay, these are questions that we routinely ask, at least I do in my lectures with my students, and it's an incredibly important perspective that Ramin is bringing forth from the perspective of the pandemic. Now, you've already given a good enough background, so I don't want to get into more of the 3 chapters of what they say, but Kairos and just sort of how you think of solidarity in these times. But there are 2 themes that I thought are worth pondering on, and which appealed to me most. And I was just curious to know how Ramin would envision them, how he thinks about them. And first of this theme is really about this question of I, me, and the other. Now, I'm just going to give you 3 short examples of what I mean, which is that on the one hand, it seems that certain spaces, there's these questions very comfortably explained. But at certain other times, I wonder if there is more that could be said, or if there is some kind of reconciliation that could be made between these kind of three prisms of looking at ourselves and the pandemic. First off would be the chapter on dissidents. Now, of course, Ramin, you say that resistance is incredibly important because resistance resistance opens up conversations on thought and thinking. So with thinking, it's about, your dissidence is the essence is in thought, an individual thought perhaps. But I was wondering, is that always so, particularly in these times? And as I look around in our society, in the Indian society right now, sometimes dissidence or resistance can be a complete act of non-thinking and complete act of following. So how do you, what was your motivation when you were thinking about this? And would dissidence always be that? Would dissidence always be about thinking? Could it also be about following? Then the other thing was, with the solidarity, I must say the book was incredibly, I thought it was the most optimistic and most glass half full kind of a perspective, really joyful perspective. And then I was like, okay, are we really, I hope it happens, but how much of solidarity are we really experiencing in these times? I only say this because, we know this, the most vulnerable of populations have been hit the hardest. I just wrote, I'm just writing on this bit on how women and child, they've been completely excluded in the space, and the vulnerabilities have been most exposed during these times. And that made me wonder, is it really the time when people would be able to feel some kind of solidarity, or is it also the time of increased paranoia? Paranoia of interacting with each other, paranoia of hugging each other, of holding each other, of visiting each other's homes. So could this be a point of understanding solidarity or hoping for solidarity of the shaken, as you poetically put it, or would it cause a kind of misanthropy going forward? So that was something that I was wondering out loud. And finally, with the chapter on death, and question again of I, me, the other, society, would be that, this is most beautiful, right? The art of dying, the dignity of dying. And you mentioned various examples of, for instance, courage, valor, whether it's the Japanese society or whether it is heroic death. Heroic death becomes really important. The meaning of life becomes evident in the experience of death, and a particular kind of death in that you're saying it's different. You mentioned than death in a car accident, and you're
right.
Talking about death that would be heroic deeds, and you give very interesting examples of Achilles and Hector. So Hector dies a heroic death because it's at the hands of Achilles, and Achilles is able to experience that life because he already has knowledge of his death. So he makes that knowledge of his death into heroic deeds. This is beautiful, and of course with the Japanese society. But I was wondering, how do we make sense of this? How do we understand this in times when I think in the most recent times of most undignified deaths, where bodies are just being kind of, just the numbers, and deaths are really, it's become a quantitative space really, and they're just being dumped, literally being dumped with the fear of the pandemic. So there's something else that's, I think there's something else that to be said about the art of dying in the current times. So I wonder if you could, could just, if you feel like comment on that. And the second theme that stood out for me in this particular book was your apprehension to the mundaneness and meaninglessness of life. Now, I completely get that. I get that to a certain extent, but also oftentimes it is the mediocrity of life, it is the mundaneness of life that makes life go. And I think again I'll invoke Durkheim, because in some ways he's saying, look, division of labor means solidarity. If everybody follows what they have to do, then it's like it would lead to solidarity. So in some senses, the mundaneness actually creates a kind of solidarity. One is that, but the other is also that the mundaneness, the everyday mundane life can also be incredibly powerful, because it can create ruptures, and it can also absorb the effects of the ruptures and actualize it. So one is that aspect. So it's, in the power of the society in that sense, or the power of human subjectivity is so absorbed in the everydayness, the mundaneness of life. So that was that. And the final bit about mundaneness, or being mediocre to that extent as well, or leading a mediocre life, to me as someone who works on elite cultures, is that it is the mundaneness of lives at times that leads to creation of cultures. So much of elite cultures, which then get trickled down to other classes, is coming out of the space of mundane life and idleness. That's how we often describe the elites as well, the idle class and things like that. So anyways, my point was merely that I get what you're saying about mediocrity. Nonetheless, my only input would be that at times it is mediocrity that is binding society together, or mundaneness together, and also incredibly creative, creating cultures, creating art. So just these two themes that I was provoked to think about. So I'll stop here for now.
Thank you so much, Parul, for dwelling on points which are, I think, as people who are not from philosophy background or might fear to read the book thinking that it's all philosophy, we are not going to understand it. But I think it's you have addressed the whole issues in a very sociological manner, including topics like phenomenology, talking about experience, empathy, and most importantly, Durkheim's concept of social solidarity. How is it valid at this point of time? So, looking at Parul's themes, I think Ramin has pointed out the issues that Parul has raised. Now we move on to our next discussant, that is Nath Pathak, and after that we are going to open the platform for more questions and discussion. So I'm handing it over to Dev currently for giving his understanding of the book.
Thank you, Antara. I must confess right in the beginning, the shine of my interjection has been stolen away by Parul. She has been discussing with me. Both of us have been discussing this book for some time. We both found the book so interesting that more than 3-4 times, I suppose, we have discussed it. And she has incorporated most of the points that I wanted to raise. And I am left with a few, which maybe at the price of repeating some of those things Parul has already said. I'll try to avoid repetition as much as possible. So to begin with, whenever I hold a book, I hold it like a lay reader, wondering about the book, trying to do all those things which we grew up doing with the books in library, in universities, in schools. Trying to feel the book, feel the texture of the book before we really take a plunge into the vortex of words, so to say. And in that sense, I found the book really like a solace for a troubled heart, particularly this year, the experience that we have all encountered this year, pandemic, lockdown, and so many instances of misery, destitute, all sorts of images flying across, various things which would put us off, would remind us of the vulgarity of the class that is capable of consuming, and so forth, and helplessness of a large number of people. The desperate attempt to... The book is, in the first go, kind of personal gain. I hear some of those things which we had heard some time ago and probably we had forgotten, or those are relatively less recalled lessons from philosophy, and this book reminds us. This book takes us to revisit some of those milestones from the texts of philosophy, and by doing so, it enables us to make sense of our existence in this kind of trying times. And that, in that regard, there is absolutely no doubt about the significance of this book. revisiting the Stoics, or my favorite, Thoreau and the Walden, and this whole idea of poetic philosophers as to how they can be very significant in making sense of our lives in contemporary world. And Ramin, for us, joins in that league of philosophers who have taken upon themselves this responsibility to help us recall the seemingly forgotten lessons. All kind of, what the book does, in addition to all these things, is that it takes me back to, and it will take any reader back to, the fundamentals. And it seems very relevant, going back to the act of going back to the fundamentals, which are variedly titled, as Antara right in the beginning gave a glimpse of the whole book, titles such as living, suffering, dying, resisting, and then finally solidarity and kairos. And these are all fundamentals which are part of our socio-cultural lives, socio-political lives, which are part of our lives in general. And probably in the mad rush identified with the idea of success, which is right in the beginning being set as a problematic in Ramin's book, or mad rush which we encounter in metropolises, right? And that's where you certainly remember that, even though he does not mention, he is probably taking forward the anxiety that we had heard from some of the classical thinkers about existence in metropolises. But he's not like George Simmel, who would consider metropolis as the heart of rationality and the peripheries or other areas as its counterpart. Instead, the ideal type for Ramin's rumination comes from the counterpart. So it's that wilderness which is more important than metropolis for Ramin's rumination. It's in that wilderness one can take a walk about and wonder about life at repose. There is no haste about anything. There is no anxious tricks about surviving a situation in that wilderness. So there is absolutely no doubt about the significance of all these reminders, and the reminders such as ontology is noiseless is a truly important reminder for us, because we have been socialized into a very noisy kind of ontology. However, that is where some anxious intellectual questioning begins as to how to imagine ontology totally noise-free. It's by and large very noisy ontology that we have been living with. Even though it is some kind of anomaly of metropolis, it is unavoidable. It's unavoidable in the sense that it conditions your way of thinking. We know, and Ramin has critically thought of Cartesian ergo cogito, but we know that without that cogito, making even a single step forward is nearly impossible in the kind of very noisy ontology that we live with, right? That's where one also begins to think whether this idea of noise-free ontology also succumbs to an allegation that we have heard about the people who have celebrated their existence during the pandemic, the people who own a flat with spacious balcony would probably have some access to that noise-free ontology. Or even better, if you think of the people who own a farmhouse or an orchard somewhere on the outskirts of the cities, probably they can, and they have been clicking photographs of themselves deep into some kind of meditation or some kind of workout, or even plucking fruits from the trees, so and so forth. And one begins to wonder whether that kind of ontology is our ideal, could be our ideal. There is also a lot of performative dimension of that ontology. There is a lot of orchestration involved in that ontology. Whereas ontology, that is the domain of ordinary, where all kind of limited reasoning takes place, which is largely guided by taken for grantedness, where we see things so closely that we cannot make sense of those things, where mediocrity becomes an essential accompaniment of excellence, so to say, right? And so that is the domain of ordinary, where one begins to rethink ontology, whether there is any possibility in that domain. That domain is not entirely absent. That domain is partly present in Ramin's rumination too. However, there is a sense, and probably that comes from his allegiance to the classical masters, in spite of the fact that he also refers to some of those who are typically known as anti-heroes, or anti-philosopher, like Nietzsche, or anti-heroes such as Achilles, more or less anti-heroes, Macbeth, right? One begins to think of this realm of ordinary as the realm of tragedies, realm of suffering. People suffer, people go through tragedies, they become anti-heroes of some sort, not following any exemplar. Probably they just do it. They just do it following some kind of ordinary logic. It's probably by and large post-Wittgensteinian world, where notions of various kinds of ordinary are colliding, clashing with one another, and that becomes a challenge for us. It demands from us more nuanced approach to ordinary. And one also remembers the fact that the whole year we have experienced our very sanitized experience, or so did we think. And likewise, we have also been receiving ideas from various means of communication, which emphasized on positive thinking. Even government machineries have been emphasizing on positive thinking. And one thought whether there is a campaign to sanitize our thinking as such, is some kind of global sanitizer at work which is sanitizing our thinking, and whether that kind of sanitized thinking will help us understand that all over the world there are multiple scripts of living, suffering, and dying. Multiple scripts of these experiences also amounts to suggesting that there is probably more possibility with that domain of ordinary, and that is why someone like Roy Bhaskar tried to locate possibility of transcendence as well within the same domain of ordinary. That's where I stop.
Thank you so much, Dev, for reflecting upon a range of reflections which started from the fundamentals of how we are looking at this rush and paranoia, and of course looking at the philosopher's point of view and how the performative part of creating a global sanitized space. Finally, now welcome the author, Ramin Jahanbegloo. Please tell us everything that you have to say today.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm flattered by this invitation, and I've been listening to what Dev and Parul have been saying about this book. I have to start by saying why I wrote this book. Actually, I think this book comes after many books which I've written, and I've tried in the past 20 years of my life to discuss a problematic which has been with me through my, I would say, tribulations around the globe. I've been living in 7 countries and traveled to 40 different countries. And as you said in the beginning, I've been writing in different languages. And I've had lots of ups and downs in my life. I mean, in relation with the social life, political life. I've been to prison, solitary confinement, fought for many causes when I was a student in Paris, for Eastern Europe, against apartheid in South Africa, human rights in Iran. And so I wanted to write a book which could go directly to the hearts and minds of my readers. So, and wanted to share with my readers actually what the feeling that I had during these lockdowns and during this pandemic. So The problematic was that I thought that the best way for me, I put a lot of attention to the writing also, because I also write poetry. I've also I try to pay attention also to the words, and that's why I read a lot of classics, and I try to incite my students, especially Indian students, to read their classics. Unfortunately, they don't. And I even incite them to watch classical movies, which they do, because I have a course actually in law school at Jindal University, which is justice and law in American movies. So they have to go and watch something like 20 classics, which usually they will not watch because they are black and white. And there is this, rejection of the classics. But it's the same with Shakespeare and Homer, and I would say even the classics of the Indian classics, I would say. They will not go and read because they don't think that they are interesting. But it is interesting. And I revisited, as Dev said, I revisited the milestones of these classics because I thought that it's important to use them if you are going to think once again about the art of living and the art of dying. They had a lot to say in the past 50 centuries, since the Sumerian civilization until today. We cannot just put it away, One of the things that I say always, I repeat, is that we are very much informed, especially with the internet, but we don't have knowledge. Everybody is informed, but no, the knowledge is not there. And it has to do with, I think, a form of arrogance, epistemological arrogance, which I've been fighting against. Of course, a great part of this epistemological arrogance comes from techno-scientific achievements, and it comes from the West, but you find it very much also in other parts of the world. And I think that to write a book like I did, you need something that's a little bit of what I call epistemic humility.
Right.
Epistemic humility helps you to open new horizons when you're looking at gender, when you're looking at life, when you're looking at death, when you're looking at cultures, when you're looking at, I would say, even language, when you want to write poetry, when you want to color and use to do a painting. You need to have this epistemic humility, and I try to have this epistemic humility in this work. And now, of course, the classics were there, and they were very important in the I would say elaborating the subject. But what was also very, very important for me is a series of questions which have been in most of my books in the past, as I said, 20 years. I've been lucky in my life during, especially the time I was a student in France for 20 years, to have met a lot of interesting people in different domains: philosophy, sociology, anthropology, going to their classes, sharing times with them, learning from those people. And so all these came back again to me, and somehow the problematic which came to my mind immediately, which are the problematics that you find in this book, first of all, is the problem with the pandemic. I started to think, well, if I'm in lockdown and I see people suffering around me, actually death, and what is life? Should we go and just read our classics, or try to redefine what the art of living is and the art of dying? So one of the problematics which immediately came to my mind is that we are living, of course, in dark times. These dark times have been lived previously by other civilizations, has been in other times. We have had other pandemics like the Black Plague in the Middle Ages, or Justinian plague. And people have been dying, and so I have to transcend that and go to another level. So I went back to the philosophers which I've been working with for a long time. For example, Schopenhauer, on whom
Right.
I studied, and I wrote a Actually, I did academic work in France, and of course, the problem of suffering comes immediately up when you go and read Schopenhauer, because there's question of will to life, and suffering is an expression of will to life, and how you will have to understand that. So the problematic immediately was, yes, we suffer, human beings suffer, and one of the aspects that the discussant didn't mention is the question of fragility, which I discuss in the book. Ontological and biological fragility. Human beings are ontologically and biologically fragile because we know that we're going to die. So we know about our frailty and our fragility. And this creates a very deep questioning in our minds, even if we have not studied philosophy or sociology or anything like that. Just as human beings, we ask the question why we should die. And that has to do, we have no answer for it. So that was the first level. The first level is the question of fragility and how we have to understand this fragility. The second level was that with the pandemic, and this is what I'm discussing in this book, is the question of shared suffering. It's not just that I suffer, is that the other is suffering too. And there's an awareness about life as shared suffering. And this is an important experience, I think, that which can happen when you have some kind of global pandemics, because one of the problems that I have, I mean, I'm very critical towards today's world, but one of the aspects which has to do directly with this book is that death has become a statistics. We just listen to the internet, we listen to the TV, we watch the TV, listen to the radio, and they announce 200 people died in a crash, 1,000 people died in the sea, a child died as a boat people in the sea, and we don't care. I mean, it's a statistic. So this is not a shared suffering, because people actually don't care, and this caring is no more there. And this the regional wars that we have all over Asia, Africa, Middle East, people dying all the time. I think that there is no shared suffering. So to make it short, the problematic which has been there for me, which is present in this book, one of the problematics, is what I call the otherness of the other. I'm not just talking about the other. There are many great philosophers that have this, like Martin Buber, Levinas. Levinas was one of my professors. Actually, I used to go to his seminars. So I know very much about this problematic of otherness, which has been present in the modern philosophy. But I'm actually trying to also talk about the otherness of the other, and this becomes very important in the situation of when we're talking about art of living and art of dying, and especially in relation with today's world, because the otherness of the other is about not only human beings, it's also about ecology, and it's about the Earth, the planet Earth, and all living beings. So here I bring the Forovian view of nature, and how we should look today as a living creature, not just at the social beings, but also at living beings, and how to care about the otherness of the other at the level of, I would say, the planet. Now, of course, let me say immediately, I think that humanity is suffering from a double alienation at this level. Alienation towards the planet Earth, and that's why the planet Earth has been destroyed at this level. And the second, alienation towards the world. We are completely alienated about the concept of the world. We don't know exactly where we are, and because of that, I think that we have been going more and more politically and socially towards what I've been criticizing, meaning a very conformist and complacent view of the society, and at the other level, towards a meaninglessness and mediocrity. Now, I define, of course, mediocrity and meaninglessness in the way that a philosopher like Kant used to define it, meaning that this is a self-incurred minority. I mean, people do not care about their level of questioning, and they don't care anymore about education. Now, I think that this is also one of the aspects that I talk about, and which is important. And I have to say immediately that this book that I've written is a trilogy, and it was followed. Each problematic is followed in another book. I mean, the problematic of death and the courage to die is in the second book, which is out now in India with the same publisher. It's called In Pursuit of Unhappiness, not In Pursuit of Happiness, but In Pursuit of Unhappiness, Reflections on Suicide. And the third one is going to be out in January, which is Pedagogy of Dissent. So the three problematics, which is actually living as suffering, dying and modes of dying, and especially if you have moral courage to die. And the third one, resisting, which is actually dissent, which I've been writing on also in the newspapers or in the magazines about them, is also very important. Now, I have to say immediately that when I talk about dissidence and dissent, I think about it as swimming against the tide and standing apart, and most important, the mode of questioning. It's the art of questioning, and that's how I define philosophy. And you said in the beginning that some people might have the fear and be scared about reading this book by saying, well, usually books of philosophy are difficult and we cannot read them. Philosophy is the art of questioning. Is the art of questioning, and that's the most important thing. So I think that we need to go back and read philosophers or have this questioning, because without this questioning, we cannot criticize the meaninglessness and the level of mediocrity that we're going towards. Now, this level of mediocrity has to do immediately with what Dev and Parul was saying, and that's the education. The education is a noise. Is a noise. Is an ontology with full of noise. You know, my definition of education is that in an education, you have to have an art of listening before anything else. You're listening to the world, you're listening to the creatures of the world, but you're also listening to your classics, and you're listening to your past. And if you don't listen to your past, we get to the poem of Rone Char, which says our inheritance is without any testament. So we are getting our heritage like we get it today, like the students that we teach. We get it today at the level of our universities or at everyday life, but there is no testament. We don't care. It's there. I mean, Achilles is there, Macbeth is there, Mishima and Foro are there, Mahabharata is there, but you don't know how to communicate with it and get into a dialogue. And actually, the heritage is supposed to be there to get in relation with that. So because of that, and what we've been fighting for, all of us been fighting for, we become indifferent towards languages. We become indifferent towards indigenous people, tribes, nomads, other cultures. We become indifferent towards the lives of others. We become indifferent towards the otherness of the others. Now, the otherness of the other, I give you immediately an example, is the frogness of the frog, is the dogness of the dog. We don't care about the dogness of the dog or the catness of the. We care about the dog and the cat as a pet.
Right.
And that's where otherness of the other is so important, you know, because the art of living is actually how you communicate, try to communicate and interconnect. And that's why I use this word. And in a very stoic way, and what Martin Luther King Jr. called cosmic fellowship. Cosmic fellowship. If we're living on a planet, we need to have this cosmic fellowship, you know. And this kind of fellowship is actually a kind of being friends with the Mother Earth, but being friend with life. So all these come to the to this level that If we want to have a noiseless ontology and an art of living, especially in moments where we have global suffering, and what I call after Patočka, the Czech philosopher, the solidarity of the shaken. People who need to have a solidarity. Solidarity is something which needs a paideia, needs a mode of self-education. It needs to be. It has to have a level of interconnectedness, and this interconnectedness is only possible if we have the moral courage to go towards the otherness of the other, not just the other, but the otherness of the other, and try to somehow talk about human society, not just as we're doing it right now with the vaccine and other things, not just as a collective survival enterprise, because the pandemic COVID-19 has become just a collective survival enterprise, and all the questions behind it have been left out.
Right.
You know, what makes me really angry and philosophically angry, I would say, is that all these questions are unanswered. We have not been responsive to the true questions that when we die at this level, why the hell do we not talk about our art of living and art of dying that we have lost?
Right.
Because we don't have a common purpose anymore, and we don't have a common responsibility. So I think all these are the points that I try to make, and of course there are many other points which are made also in other books which are also important. For example, the political and the social questions like democracy, the rise of populism, the conformism, as I said. I think they are very, very interrelated, and they have to do. If we don't solve one question, we cannot get to the other question. So we have to be very, very careful about that. And I have to say that it's very unfortunate, and this is what I'm working on. It's very unfortunate that 21st century is living in a very corporate mindset. And corporate mindset is all based on utility and not empathy. So
True.
the two things which are not important for a corporate mindset that we see also in India, even at the level of the academia, is art of living and art of dying. It's only about utility and it's about success, or the only thing. And let me finish by just quoting. There's one quote about Thomas Merton, this Christian monk, which I like very much. He said, when we think too much about success, we forget how to live. And this is what has been happening in the 21st century to our societies. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much, Ramin, for telling us in a better way about the book and the questions that you have raised, especially the point about the fragile lives of humans and the double alienation that currently we are facing, not just about the pandemic, but the already damage that was done since the World War II and the technological damages that we have seen till now. And I would really say that we, all of us as readers, are looking forward to read your next upcoming two books, which will be a trilogy on it. I mean, it's really nice. I would like to say The Courage to Die. I mean, it sounds interesting itself as of now. So I really hope all of us to read about that. And so thank you so much. I would like to extend my thanks to our two discussants, Parul and Dev, for joining us today to discuss on this book. And of course, Ramin to come himself and tell us about the book. And I would really say that, and would like to conclude with what Ramin said, that we have all the characters. We have Iliad, we have Shakespeare, we have Mahabharata here, but what we need is a kind of a dialogue between what we have read and contextualize within our understanding. And also reflect upon the time how Thoreau says, and in fact, even Ramin talks about it in his book, the immortality of the soul. That in this pandemic, somewhere we feel that our souls are immortal and we are living in the current new normal, the pandemic crisis, and situationalizing ourselves into being a better, positive people. So, thank you so much. And yes.